Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Everyday Ethics for Registered Behavior Technicians. My name is Dr. Shannon Hill. I am a BCBA doctoral level and a senior learning designer for OBGOBI. So I just want to call attention to the fact that it is everyday ethics that we're talking about. So we're not going to really spend any time talking about extreme situations. Usually when something is a really big deal, the decision-making process is going to be a little bit easier. So today we're going to talk about the things that happen in the everyday life of an RBT that might make you stop and pause and think, what is the right thing to do here? How do I go about solving these problems? And we will have a little process where we talk about the ideas, and then I will give you some scenarios to consider. We'll have some questions for you. We just want you to type your responses into the chat box when those polls appear. But if you have other questions as we go ahead and type those into your chat box as well, and we'll take as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. Okay, so specifically today we're going to talk about maintaining integrity, supporting your clients, making that decision about what is the best way to support your clients in certain situations, how to avoid the pitfalls of multiple relationships, and then record keeping and confidentiality. Obviously, this is not covering everything that is in the code, but we have a limited amount of time, so we're just going to zone in on those things, and we will probably be bringing in multiple pieces of the code in each one of those scenarios, because most of the time ethical dilemmas are doing that. They're not clear cut, and your ethical and compliance code will give you guidance in various parts of that, and I think that'll become more clear as we go through. Okay, so let's begin with the topic of working with integrity. First thing to do is to define what is integrity. And so I have on the screen for you 3 pictures. Most of us, when we take a look at Abraham Lincoln, we have a word that comes to mind, and that word is honesty. So when you are working with integrity, you are being honest. Your next picture is the scales of justice. So a person who is operating with integrity is honest and they are fair. So the last one might have you a little bit more confused about why is that there. You're on target, right? So the person who is shooting the arrows at this target is very consistently hitting the bullseye. So that is there to remind you that a person who is operating with integrity is predictable. They're consistent. The people who are looking to them for guidance or an opinion know where that's coming from. And after they get to know you for a while, they can kind of predict what you're going to say. And so for those of us who work in the field of behavior analysis, we're going to draw from a particular framework in order to be on target that way. And of course, our framework is behavior analysis. And Skinner, in his book Science and Human Behavior, in one of those first chapters, gives us something to draw from in keeping ourselves on track with this. And so your pictures here, the first guy, he's obviously a detective. He's got that newspaper in front of him, but he's not reading it, right? He's looking for himself. And Skinner really emphasizes this point, that although as practitioners of behavior analysis, we do pay attention to what other people's opinions are. We read their documentation, we listen to them in interviews, and just anecdotally as they're talking to us through the course of work. But that is only a jumping off point for us. We make our treatment plans based on our direct observations, using the observational skills that we learned in school. And as an RBT, you may not be the person that is developing that plan, but you will be getting a lot of feedback from the people you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And your job is to report that back in as objective a way as you possibly can in order to help the behavior analyst form any plans for revision, or if it's a part of the functional behavior assessment period, whatever. But also, you're going to present your own observations with a trained eye in addition to that. The other thing is, practitioners of behavior analysis don't get so locked in to their own thoughts and their own belief systems that they can't turn around and go the other way when the data points them that way. And that's a very human thing. You know, I've got gray hair now, so I've been doing this work for quite a while, and I still have to really monitor myself not to jump to a conclusion right off the bat. Sometimes my conclusions now, instead of being based on, you know, things I observed as a child or being raised, whatever, now my conclusions are based on many years of experience working with people and helping to change behavior. However, I am still wrong in those initial knee-jerk reactions some of the time. But I have to be open to the fact that I'm going to still follow the process I was trained to follow, collect the data, and that's what's going to shape my decision-making process. And the third one, we have a cute little, I think he's a puppy, sometimes I think he's a fox, whatever he is, he's adorable, and he is waiting so very patiently. And this, as an RBT, might be the hardest part of your day-to-day interactions with other people who are not trained in behavior analysis. Because many times when we are pulled into a situation, it is because someone is in distress, and the people who care about them, whether we're talking about teachers or parents or support providers, they want to see change and they want it to start immediately. Whereas we're trained to go through this assessment period first, and we don't just jump in and start to work until we know what our data is telling us we need to do. The other times that it might be uncomfortable is that we also don't change our plans if they don't work the way we want them to the very first try, right? We are very aware of things like extinction bursts and that behavior might actually worsen before it gets better, and that doesn't mean your plan is wrong. And that can be very uncomfortable for others that we'll be working with sometimes. And so when you're in those kinds of situations where you've got people saying, but I know what's happening, you just need to do what I say, or, you know, so set on an idea and the data is leading us otherwise in another direction, or we're getting a lot of pressure to move, change, then we go back to, in our thinking, what we were trained as practitioners to do. And this can bring calmness to you. It's very important to be calm when you're making decisions about ethical situations. Okay, and here, this is just a reminder that all of our rules and policies, regulations, laws begin with a foundation in ethics. So our ethics are the broadest. That's where we draw from. There are many other situations that will arise where you're getting guidance from either what the law says, what the policy of your organization says, what school rules are, all the way up to what is the classroom or the house rules. And so when filtering through all of this, go back to the original. What was the ethical piece of this that led to this rule? And sometimes, you know, in any situation, you can read sometimes from the ethical guidance, sometimes from the law, sometimes from rules, and interpret things two ways. So go back to what was the ethical guidance, what were we trying to achieve, and use that as your guide. And along those lines, when making decisions like that, integrity, remember, is not the same as expediency all the time. It is not always the fastest thing to do the right thing. And we have to remember that just like our bodies are really good at, well, with practice especially, some of these yoga moves, we can contort our bodies, but we can also contort our minds. And we are human beings. We have to remind ourselves that we do not use our ethics codes to justify what we want to do. We use them as our guide in determining what we should be doing. And at the same time, we use that same framework of thinking when thinking about what other people are trying to get us to do. And other people have some good reasons and some bad reasons sometimes for trying to pull us one way or another. And so you go back into the thinking of, why is this person taking me here? What was my training? Why do I want to do it this way? And just make sure that you're not accidentally get pulled into something that you shouldn't. This is particularly important for RBTs because you are frequently working in situations where you are the only person trained in behavior analysis, and the other people around you have either no particular training or training from a different framework of thinking. And it can be hard to maintain your integrity, that on-target part of your integrity, when all you're hearing is information from people who have different perspectives. So for this reason, professional development is critically important. We need to make sure that you have contact with others, that you're talking frequently with your supervisor, that you get ongoing training that keeps your mind focused on that framework that you originated from. Okay, so let's take our first example situation. And in these scenarios, I have color-coded for you. Anyone that you are working directly with will be colored blue, and the other people who are involved in the scenario, other levels of stakeholders, will be in orange. You are always the RBT in these scenarios. So in your first one, Abigail is working at a local grocery store stocking shelves, and she has difficulty remembering to move out of the way when a customer is in the aisle. She's also made some nasty comments to her job coach, Anna, when Anna corrects this behavior. So you have been working with them using a shaping procedure, and Abigail is making progress. You and the behavior analyst have both talked with Anna about avoiding trigger words when giving corrective feedback, but Anna often says these words before she thinks. Now, as part of your time with them, you have learned a lot about Anna in addition to learning about Abigail, and you know that Anna is having a lot of personal issues, that she's highly stressed, and that probably contributes to the fact that she continues to forget what words she should and should not say. So yesterday, Anna corrected Abigail using one of those trigger words, and Abigail screamed at her, creating a scene in the store. Anna is asking you, please do not report her use of the trigger word because she is afraid she will be fired. First question. What do you think will happen if you go along with Anna's request? So if you will, just go ahead and fill out that poll. Do you think Anna will continue to make the same mistake? Do you think the BCBA will think the behavior plan doesn't work? Do you think Abigail's behavior will worsen? Or do you think the RBT will be fired for falsifying records? Okay. So because of the way ethical situations go, I can give you lots of scenarios and we can work through how we would end up going in a given situation. But I think it is even more important for us to talk about how do we come to those conclusions, what parts of the professional and ethical compliance codes are we pulling from in order to think these things through. So on your thinking it through slides, we have several things. First, it's going to be broken down into codes that are directly relevant to this situation. And because we don't have time to talk about every single thing, I'm just highlighting in green the ones that I will talk about today. I do hope that you will think about this more and maybe go back and look at those that are in black later on your own. We're also going to talk about additional considerations, that maybe this isn't applying right now, but depending on which decision you make, could become kind of a snowball effect. So in this situation, obviously we have to talk about integrity because Anna is asking you to lie, right? And we don't want to do that. That shouldn't be a part of the dilemma here for you, whether you should or should not. The question is, or whether or not it is a lie. The question is, what are all of the effects that are going to happen from choice A or choice B? You do also have to think about, what are you going to do about the fact that Anna is asking you to lie? Do you have a further obligation to take some sort of action because she is asking for an unethical thing from you, which means she's behaving in an unethical way as well? Okay. Before we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but before I move, I just want to remind you, in that additional considerations, the snowball effect is that if you agree with Anna that it's not that big of a deal, you don't have to report that, that means that you're probably going to be documenting incorrectly. And there are all kinds of things that go wrong from there. Perhaps the behavior analyst is looking at data at some time down the line, and because the behavior analyst would not know that this trigger word was used, she would think that maybe the behavior plan isn't working, or that they need some added components that they didn't. Maybe this data gets used to make a decision about whether or not Abigail gets to stay in her work placement. And wouldn't that be terrible? So we do have to think two or three steps down the line in making these decisions. But let's talk about whether or not you need to make a report on someone. The BACB is just, they have been wonderful as far as giving us tools to make these kinds of uncomfortable decisions. And one of the things they've given us is some guidance for how and at what level to report other people's ethical violations. So the first thing you ask yourself is, was there a potential for harm? And when we think about this particular case, is Abigail physically hurt? No. Is Abigail emotionally hurt? We have to think about that a little bit. That's a possibility, I guess. She's yelling and screaming. There is, probably some sort of emotional or social consequence to her, but does it fall into what we think of in a legally binding definition of neglect, abuse, those sorts of things? It's probably not to that level, but again, because you have that little bit of gray, never ever as an RBT feel like you have to make these decisions on your own. When you feel this level of grayness, talk to your supervisor, certainly, okay? Is there a mandatory reporting condition? If you do not know the answer to that for your state, let me give you a website here, and it is in your handout as well. This website goes state by state and lists all of the laws about child abuse reporting and vulnerable adults reporting in each area. So that can be a wonderful asset. Although it does vary a little state by state, overall, it's is someone being exploited? Is someone being neglected? Is someone being physically, sexually, emotionally abused? And when we're talking about one incident like this, probably would not rise to that occasion. If we have a pattern, that would be something different. And then last, is there a regulation or a policy? This will depend on your organization, but I will tell you that most of the time, if someone is being served by an organization and a functional behavior assessment is requested, and they invest a lot of resources in this, especially to the point that you are there on a daily basis, they want those plans to be followed. And so there probably is some sort of regulation or policy that says once there's a behavior intervention plan in place, it must be followed. So when there's a regulation or a policy, there is almost always attached to it what to do if you see someone who is not following it. And this can be hard. This can be emotional. And when you go all the way back to the bottom of that pyramid in ethics, and you will find yourself thinking about things like, what if they take Anna away from Abigail and all the rest of their supports are really good? All of that is way beyond where you need to be thinking. Your decision is, what is my responsibility? You have to trust that other people who are in the organization can think along those lines too, and they can think about the big picture. But you just go through your checklist and determine, who do I need to report this to? Is it to the point that I have to report it legally, or can I just talk to someone about it? And in your code, they will give you guidance, and they say very explicitly, if it doesn't rise to all of these levels and it's something that you can talk to a person about and just fix it if it's something small, great. But even as an RBT, even if you're doing something like that, you really need to let your supervisor, your supervising BCBA, know that that is happening. You don't know what all other effects are going to occur from that. So you need to have free and open dialogue with your BCBA. Okay, let's move on to your responsibilities to clients. The first thing is to identify who is your client. It's great if you have a client who looks like this. They're just so cute and adorable and easy to deal with. But the fact of the matter is, it's very rarely just that, especially if they are children. So you usually will have multiple stakeholders involved, and they can be called a client at a certain degree. So we're talking about parents, teachers, support workers, and even administrators. They all have a piece of this, and you have some responsibility to all of them. So BCBA recommends that we have some sort of hierarchy process, and that all people involved know what that hierarchy is. It is not the job of the RBT to establish this hierarchy. This should be done before you come into the picture. It should be explained to you who's responsible for what and to whom do you need to talk to about different things. But you need to have some sort of concept of what it looks like. Most people are going to put it into writing. Some will just talk about it, but you have to have a clear picture. So I painted you one here. This is just an example. If you have a minor child, you may say that when it comes to the health and safety and clear benefit, that is the primary client, right? So if anything is going on and I feel like this child is at risk, then my responsibilities to everyone else become secondary, and I'm going to do what I have to do to keep this child safe. So in most cases, a parent or a guardian is going to have significant rights when there's a minor child. And so those rights might include, first and foremost, to decide whether or not they want you to be serving their child. They do have the right to refusal. They have a right to be a part of or to be the main drivers of the goal setting situation. They have accountability rights. They need to know and deserve to know what is the progress that we're making. Support workers, and I put that because some of you will be working in schools, some of you are working in homes, others in organizations. So anyone who's not a guardian but has some sort of caretaking responsibility, I'm thinking of as a support worker. So support workers generally are not going to have big picture rights, but they will have small picture rights, meaning specific goal setting. If a child is misbehaving in the classroom, the teacher deserves to have some input into what kind of behavioral goals will be put into place. Maybe it's about scheduling. Let's say that you're working with a preschool and you're wanting to run some sort of discrete trial session, but you're trying to do it at a time when they're working on another goal. They get some rights there. But do they have the right to say, no, you can't serve this child because it's inconvenient for me? The answer is no. Case managers within organizations are going to have some rights as well, especially with regard to what kind of progress is this person making, if they are responsible for either paying directly or helping the family access financial resources to pay for services. You may have to deal with them in terms of billing. This is going to vary widely. So this is something that is given to you as an example, not as take a picture of this. This is the way it is all the time. Some organizations, for example, especially if you get into adult services, the case manager might be more of a team leader, and the programs that you're running may be going through an interdisciplinary team for approval, and so they would have a little bit of a higher level of authority. So again, this is an example of how you should be able to think of any client that you're working with. Okay? And I'm giving you here, this is just a list of some of the client's rights and prerogatives. I'm not going to go through all of this. You will get this in other training. I want to point out the first two for today. Remember that at any time, any of your clients on that hierarchy can ask to see your credentials. And that should be something that you provide openly without defensiveness. And then second, your clients have the right to consent to recording and for each use of the recording. RBTs mostly are engaged in recording for supervisory purposes. So you have a supervisor who needs to see what you're doing to give you feedback, and they just want you to record your sessions because they can't come. That's okay, as long as, if we're talking about a child or a vulnerable adult who has a guardian, that the guardian or parent approves this. However, I do want you to remember that there is something called assent in addition to consent. Consent is legally binding, and that's what you have to get from the person who acts on behalf of the minor or the vulnerable adult. However, the person who you are recording has the right to say no as well. They have the right to assent. It's not legally binding, meaning it's not enough. You must have the consent as well. But if you have someone who is clearly uncomfortable with being recorded and they're expressing that to you, either behaviorally or verbally, you need to accept that. And you can turn those recording devices off as soon as you pick that up, and you talk about it with your supervisor. There are other ways to get recordings. There are other ways for your supervisor to see your work. Okay, so let's take an example situation of identifying the rights of various levels of clients. You have recently been assigned to work daily with Hassan, who is a student in a self-contained classroom. And your goal is to increase demand tolerance, and this is specified in his behavior intervention plan. When you enter the classroom on the third day, the teacher intercepts you and complains that Hassan is having too many tantrums when you run his sessions. She's not interested in having him tolerate demands. She's interested in preventing tantrums. She has discovered that he has very few tantrums when he's allowed to sit in a beanbag all day and choose whether or not he participates in various aspects of the class. She does not want you to run any more sessions with him in her classroom. All right, so what do you think? What is the first thing you would say to this teacher? And then this one, we only want one answer. So are you going to look at her and say that's unethical? Or are you going to say, I'm sorry that this has caused problems in the classroom? Are you going to say, let's discuss this with the principal? Or are you going to say, okay, no problem? Whoops. Okay. Look how smart you guys are. That's what I would say too. It's a really good idea to start with an empathic statement there. We're going to think the rest of the scenario through based on your items in green here. Professional and scientific relationships. And that is the main reason that you make the empathic statement. You need, as an RBT, to be forming working relationships with people who were not trained in behavior analysis. Because things like not understanding extinction bursts cause a lot of trouble between people of different training philosophies. So that's the first thing. But the second thing you have to think about, let's say you put the work in, that you talk with her and you explain what's going on and you explain the big process. Back up just a second. The statement that she made is a really big red flag, that she didn't understand the process to begin with. So we definitely need to convey that to your BCBA. Your BCBA probably needs to sit back down with her. But as an RBT, you will be developing rapport with these teachers, and you can explain some of these things too. But you also want your BCBA to know that there's a problem. Okay. Sometimes it does happen that you will put so much work and energy into explaining this process, but people have their own agendas and they don't want to hear it, and their mind is made up. At that point in time, you and your BCBA have to start thinking about, what does my responsibility pyramid look like? And when you do that, hopefully you see immediately that the person you're most responsible to is Hassan. And then below Hassan, you have his family and their goals for him. And then below him, maybe you have some considerations for the teacher and what her desires are. So that helps you see immediately that last question, okay, no problem, that last choice is definitely the most wrong choice in the group. It is a problem, and we have to bring her along, or it needs to be dealt with in an administrative capacity if those attempts fail. Additionally, I have in here, and that's discussed already, she is a client. So you will try to find, if you're smart, you will try to find something to give her some control over. Like in the example before, that if it had to do with time of day, you might work with her on, I understand if I come in at 7:30 in the morning and run these, I'm so sorry, and run these programs, that it can be problematic for the rest of the day. And so the thing to do would be to maybe work with her on different times that would work for her. You can give her some rights, but she doesn't have the right to say no. Okay, moving into multiple relationships. When you are providing behavior analytics services, you're practicing within a community. And those communities, even if you live in a large city, if you are from New York City, the community of people with autism or other developmental disabilities that you will be working with begins to shrink. And so you're going to find a lot of overlap with people. And if you live in a small town, like I do, where there's not a whole lot of behavior analytics services available, you're going to start to see a lot of repetition among people. And so the behavior analyst certification board's codes are clear that the number one choice when it comes to serving people is to not have multiple relationships. But let me give you a couple of examples that happen frequently. You may have a friend who has a baby, and that baby ends up getting diagnosed with autism. Your friend is going to know that this is your area of expertise, if it is, and they're going to come to you, and they're going to trust you the most for guidance, and they're going to ask very well-meaning questions about what should I do next. Those disability advocacy groups will have interactions with people in various settings, and so you have to be very aware of when I'm wearing my RBT hat and I'm delivering services, and when I'm just a member of a group, okay, and not to blend those two. So for me, because I do work in a small area, I will go to schools and do behavioral consultations. And on those days when I'm in that school, I put on my imaginary BCBA CAPE, and I go in and I do behavior analytic work all day long. Now, I might turn around and go back to that very same school later that night to see my son perform in a band concert. And at that time, I'm wearing a different colored invisible cape. I'm wearing my parent cape, and I do not provide behavior analytic services when I'm wearing my parent cape. And that's step number one in avoiding trouble. Be clear about the boundaries in your own mind. And if you haven't started thinking about these things yet, the earlier you start thinking about this, the fewer complications you will have down the road. I highly recommend compartmentalizing your work. And by that, I mean, let's say I've worked with a teacher at a school doing consultation work on a student that she has. But she also has a child with autism, and she shows up in the clinic that I work in and wants services. She and I need to sit down early, day one, and talk about the fact that this is a multiple relationship. Preferably, there's someone else I can refer her to. And as an RBT, your role, let's say that you get assigned to the classroom of a person that you are good friends with. This is something that needs to be talked about with your BCBA supervisor and probably the principal of the school, looking preferably for someone else to do it. If that is an impossibility, then you really have to plot out what this means. Okay? In different types of relationships, you're going to have different levels of boundary. But the main boundary that will help you the most is you provide behavior analytic services in that prescribed setting, and when you have interactions with this person outside of that, you don't talk about it, you don't think about it, you only do what you're there to do. Highly recommend, if those multiple relationships cannot be avoided, that it is written down what the rules are, what they can expect from you, what you can expect from them, what parts of your relationship will have to cease in order for you to provide these services. So, for an example of that, maybe it's someone that you haven't had contact with in several years, but you are friends and you do talk to each other. Maybe you go to dinner parties together, things like that. It would be specified that while I'm providing services and for 2 years afterwards, none of that will occur. Stick to those agreements, providing verbal reminders to other people, the other parties, as needed. And because this is an extreme thing, I'm not going into it, but I am putting in big capital letters for you. Do not be involved in sexual relationships with your clients. Just don't. Social media is presenting more and more problems for people in the field of behavior analysis in terms of multiple relationships. So we're giving it its own slide. You have to be very, very careful. And what does that mean? For me, personally, it means that I do not have, as Facebook friends or Instagram friends or Snapchat friends or anyone that I serve or anyone that I have served. I think if you go to the code, you will see some guidance about the number 2 years for certain types of relationships. So at the minimum, that's what that needs to be. There are ways to separate it. I have friends who are behavior analysts who have 2 separate Facebook pages, and one is the professional page and one is the personal page, and they do not allow their friends to find them on the personal page. And there are settings that you can do for that. So at the same time, you should be aware of what you say on social media. Even if it's not specifically about someone, sometimes people go on these pages and they make comments about being dissatisfied with their work, don't like someone that they work with, and they think they're being vague. But you don't know, because Although you can control who your friends are, it's very hard to control who your friends' friends are. And people see things that you didn't intend for them to. So be very respectful. My best advice is don't make any comments at all, other than, hey, I work for a great place, things like that are very, very generic. Nothing that anyone your best friend, your spouse, if they couldn't understand what you were talking about, maybe it's okay. But if it can be figured out at all, just don't say it. And I have the slides out of order, Heather, so we asked the quick poll after I gave the information. So we'll do a little review for you. What are some things you can do to keep clear boundaries on social media? And you can select as many of those as you think apply. Very good. That is right. You cannot ask for consent. Not good enough. All right, let's look at our multiple relationships scenario. You have been providing home-based services to Clarissa and Simon's 5-year-old twins for 20 hours per week for over 2 years. You've assisted them through many difficult situations with their twins, and both clearly value your help, coaching, and support. But lately you've noticed tension between the two of them. One day, after Simon leaves for work, Clarissa confides that she thinks he is having an affair. She picks up her phone to show you screenshots of text messages she took from his phone. I hope that no one thinks it's okay to look at the phone, because it absolutely is not. That shouldn't even be your question. I hope that the question you guys are asking yourselves has to do with, how do I get out of this terrible situation that I'm in? Working in people's homes is very intimate, and this would be an example of a scenario with multiple relationships where you didn't enter it as a multiple relationship, but it has danger of becoming one because of the level of intimacy involved. So we have to be extremely careful. For me, the main thing is to be empathic, to be kind, but to be firm. So you're going to say something along the lines of, hey, Clarissa, I am so sorry that you guys are going through this. It sounds very, very stressful, and it seems like you do need to talk to someone, but it needs to be one of your friends, or it needs to be, a minister or a counselor of some type, because I'm afraid that if I get to know too much about the situation, it's going to affect my work with the twins, and they have to be my first concern, just like I know they're yours. And it's going to be uncomfortable. There's no getting out of this being briefly uncomfortable. But in the long run, it's going to be a lot less uncomfortable than if you read that. So you're definitely not going to read it. The other thing that I will throw out here as an additional consideration that happens sometimes, you may be thinking that Clarissa is just confused because you spent so much time together, she's seeing you as a friend. Another possibility, people know that we're trained in psychology-related field. And people often make the assumption that if you are trained in one field of psychology, you are competent in all of them. And you don't know. She may be leading up to asking you for some sort of professional advice. And that is way beyond your boundary of competence. So that is another reason to stay out of this completely. Okay, and in our last section, we are going to talk about records and confidentiality. So when it comes to record keeping, who is keeping those records? Absolutely you are. What kinds of records are you keeping? Of course, this will vary based on what exactly your job is, but all of these kinds of things are part and parcel of the work. To stay out of ethical dilemmas, one of the main things you can do is be diligent about when you keep your records. You keep your records as soon as possible. Definitely the same day. And if it's client data, you collect that in session. Even if the behavior that you're tracking occurs rarely and you know that you can count it in your mind and go write it down later, it is asking for trouble. Things happen to prevent later from happening. So collect your client data as you're running your session. Where do you keep your records? This is another thing that can get you into lots of trouble. Your records are to be kept in designated secure places. Ideally, even if you work in multiple locations, ideally, there is a place in the site where you work where the records live, and you don't take them out of that site. I understand the reality is that many RBTs are driving from site to site and they are carrying their data books with them in their cars. If you are doing this, it is even more important that you follow those guidelines for HIPAA, that you do not have names or identifying information on anything in your data books, that everything is coded in some sort of uncrackable code. Thinking about why you keep records will also keep you out of trouble. In addition to just tracking whether or not you're doing your job and tracking whether or not the person is making progress, your records are used for billing. Sometimes if your records aren't kept appropriately, that's going to prevent you from being paid. So usually that's pretty motivating to us. You're verifying that services have been provided. You're communicating with that. And again, remembering that everything you do when it comes to record keeping lives way beyond your interaction with this person. And it could be years later that this data is pulled if someone you're working with has a resumption of a behavior that had gone away, or something new has emerged and they want to see what worked in the past. If your data is haphazard, you may not be giving accurate information, and that can lead to inappropriate programming. And then, of course, how you do your record keeping, you will be trained. You have some general training as part of your RBT training, but you will get specific training by whoever you're working for, how they want their records kept. Do those things and you will stay out of trouble. With confidentiality, I want you to remember that we are talking not only about what you say, but what you write, and especially kind of interesting for our talks today, our digital and incidental communication. More and more of us are running sessions with our iPads or our laptop computers, and that's great if we can integrate technology in a meaningful way. But you have to be very careful, because I don't know very many RBTs who have one device for their record keeping and another one for their treatment. If you're working for an organization that gives you that, go say thank you, because it makes life much, much easier and record keeping much more secure. Many of us are using a single device. So if that is you, there is no right answer other than you have multiple logins. And if you accidentally are logged in as you and hand it to a child to run a program, these children are very quick to click on a tab and be looking at data that belongs to one of their friends and asking you questions about, oh, I didn't know you were working with Mario as well. So you need to be very conscientious about that. Then incidental contact, that's things like I was describing earlier, running into parents or teachers or even the children themselves that you're serving. You have consent forms about confidentiality hopefully in place. But remember always, regardless of what is said by the person that you're serving when they approach you, that you are bound to handle information in a confidential way. So even if this parent is approaching you and asking you questions about their child's progress while you're standing at the grocery store, you need to find a way to stop that conversation right there in a kind and gentle and respectful way. The best way to do that is to say, hey, you know what? I will be in my office at 9 a.m. Why don't you give me a call and we'll go through it thoroughly. And then you're out of it and it's good. So let's look at an example for the confidentiality section. A mod is your school-based client in a very small town. Many of the teachers and students and administrators, everyone knows everyone. A lot of them are related to each other. Everyone knows everyone's business. Except he has a first-year teacher who is new to the area. This is Adolfo. The teacher across the hall is named Mrs. Jordan, and she approaches you in the hallway between classes and says, "Are you the one working with a mod? I have known him and his family for years. I know Ms. Adolfo already talked to the behavior analyst who did the FBA, but I can probably fill you in on some things she didn't know. What that boy has been through. You know, his parents were both in jail. And last year, a mod hit at least 6 different teachers. So if you'll give me a copy of that report, I can tell you what's missing from it." So what do you think? When would you interrupt her is the question. At what part of the sentence? Are you the one working with a mod? What that boy has been through? His birth parents are in jail? Or get me a copy of that report. We have a split. You're going to stop him at, "Are you the one working with a mod?" or stop her at that point. Remember that when it comes to privacy and confidentiality, even though sometimes it feels silly because you know you're walking down the hall with the kid and everybody knows, but you are not supposed to acknowledge to anyone who doesn't have direct involvement that you are even serving someone. So directly relevant to this situation, of course, is maintaining confidentiality. You have multiple levels of it here, that whether or not you're serving him is not her business because she is not directly involved in this, that you're having this conversation in the hallway between classes. And I do want to take a minute because that is something that is such a huge cultural thing in schools I have found. Teachers want to talk about situations in the hallway. And when you think about it, there's probably some good reasons for that. Teachers have small amounts of free time. It's very difficult sometimes. It means that someone has to be pulled in from another place to cover their class while they come and talk with you. But again, I would handle this very similarly as with the Clarissa situation or the person in the grocery store and just say, "You know what? I really want to talk to you about this," if that person has a right to be talking about it. So let me make an appointment. Now, as an RBT, the particular information that she is wanting to share with you has to do with the FBA. And so obviously the first thing that you're going to say by stopping her is, I need to let my RBT know that you feel, I need to let my BCBA know that you have some information that needs to be shared. Let me take your number and I will give it to her and be done with that conversation. We want to not buy into the hallway talking, even though we have empathy for it. You've got to either make an appointment with the BCBA or an appointment for you to talk, if it is appropriate for you, in a different place. And again, you're going to go through your decision-making matrix about the fact that this teacher, she's not a BCBA, she's not an RBT, but she does understand the rights of privacy as a professional. And so you're going to go through that matrix and determining who do I need to talk to about the fact that she's having confidential information. She's trying to share that with me in the hallway. And possibly this is one of those situations where just by talking with her about it privately and respectfully, if it doesn't happen again, it can be left alone, but you are still going to let your BCBA supervisor know. You're not going to make that decision alone. Okay? And then additional considerations, just make sure that you're not accidentally disclosing something, that you don't have a clipboard open with the kid's name on it of what you're about to do and target behaviors and things like that. Okay, we are at the end of our time, so let me just wrap this up. Here's some take-home messages for you that are in your handout. Basically, this is just saying, do what you're supposed to do the way you were trained to do it. Be honest, be fair. Those third and fourth bullets are really good questions to ask yourself when you feel that twinge of I'm not sure what's right. If you will go through those 4 questions, 5 questions, it helps a lot. Okay? And remembering to follow your kindergarten rules, keep private things private, own up to your mistakes. Covering up for mistakes that you have made oftentimes just leads to many worse ethical problems. Okay? When in doubt, always seek supervision. And the BACB does provide this email address to BACB Legal. If you've got questions, they're really good about getting an answer back to you within a couple of days.